Dr. Fleet Maull, nice to meet you. How are you today?
I'm great. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. You're about the third or fourth mindfulness professional that I've spoken to in the last 6 months.
Uh-huh.
Seems to be in the air these days, which is good news for the world.
I think so.
I agree. So I'd love to, I want to get into a lot. I have some intersection with your world as having taken, I think, three MBSR courses, mindfulness based stress reduction.
Hmm.
Been to Spirit Rock, been to, have about 1,000 hours of yoga certifications. And I got my start in Zen at age 21
Oh, wow.
with them. Yeah. So I'd love to talk to you about that. I'm not like a serious Zen practitioner anymore, but I credit that with kind of getting me on a meditative path myself. So
Hmm.
this interview will come from a little bit of that perspective, and that I understand a tiny bit of your world, but I'm fascinated with it, and I think it's so important. But your story is incredible. Like, give us a sense of your upbringing and what led you to, the the turnaround point, which is the 14 years you spent in jail, which is incredible, and then we'll get into the work that you've done since then, which is helping a lot of people.
Sure. So I grew up in the Midwest, Roman Catholic family. Uh, um, I don't know, for anybody that grew up in the 1950s, kind of middle class, leave it to Beaver, kind of, suburban world. And my family had a family business. And good basic family. I had a good education, but there was all the shadow stuff happening. We had alcoholism in my family, and
Mm,
uh, I think that created a real kind of psychic split for me, and I ended up kind of growing up with a big hole in my gut and a lot of stuff going on, and graduated from high school in 1968, which was one of the most tumultuous years in U.S. history,
mhm,
culturally and politically, with all the assassinations and so forth. And at any rate, I was just classic angry young man, and the timing of the counterculture, I just went headlong into that, and I was pretty well immersed in it already in high school, and eventually became kind of disillusioned with the craziness of the times. The whole, I was definitely full blown into drug, sex, and rock and roll, and anti-war politics, and all the rest of it,
mhm,
and but I became, kind of disillusioned with things, was looking for something real, and took off traveling in Latin America, just hoping to plug back into something real. I remember in my early childhood things being very vivid and real and magical, feeling very kind of plugged into
mhm,
reality. And somewhere around starting school, that kind of disappeared. I don't know whether it was just entering into school or whether it was the alcoholism in my family, whatever. Things just went from being vivid, real, and magical to kind of gray tones, and I never
mm,
really accepted that. And so I was
mhm,
always, looking for something, and somehow I had this idea that I would find it traveling in South America, and I have even had this idea about getting to Peru, and uh,
mhm.
and I it took over a year to get there. Spent almost a year on a sailboat in the Caribbean and traveling all
Wow.
through Central America and Latin America, and quite an adventure. I did finally make it to Peru, and I did discover something really genuine and real there. Very magical place. And the first time I returned to the U.S., I ran out of money, had to come back and work for a while, and I realized I wasn't able to bring that back with me. It was kind of environmental, and
What can I
you know,
pause you here for a
yeah,
second?
sure.
What do you think you discovered in Peru?
Well, yeah, it's hard to say exactly, but uh, I was living up. I mean, the whole country was pretty magical, but especially living up in the Sacred Valley of the Incas,
Right.
in the Cusco Urubamba region.
Mhm.
Um, you'd wake up in the morning, and it was almost like you had consumed some kind of psychoactive substances. It was just, just environmentally, it was so powerful in that way.
Did you
And
participate in any of that while you were down there, or would come across that? Like
Yeah,
any ayahuasca
I
or
definitely
something?
was, I was still involved in drugs, although not the kind of hard drug usage I'd been involved in previous to starting my travels. I'd gotten involved in all the craziness. I mean, a lot of psychedelic experimentation, but then got up into hard drugs and IV drug
Mhm.
usage and so forth. And in some
Wow.
ways, I was traveling to escape that world. And
Mhm.
the drug thing kind of shifted into the background during my travels in South America. Much more interest in indigenous culture and the
Mhm.
archaeology and the ruins and the history of these
Mhm.
places, and but it was still there. And then in South America, I got very into experimentation with a uh, a cactus source for basically mescaline, which is different than the peyote cactus we have here in the U.S. It's called San Pedro down there.
Right.
It's a little
I've heard of
different,
that.
and
Mhm.
but anyway, that's still it wasn't just the fact of that. It was literally something about that environment. It was just a
Right.
really magical place, and
The energy level of the entire region is
yeah, just the
vibrating the
energy
entire
level of
world.
the region. Yeah, very much so. Um, but at any rate, I was still looking, and I ended up back in Peru again. And eventually, while down there, I'd been on a spiritual journey my whole life, and really always been a spiritual seeker. And so I had all this craziness of the counterculture going on the one hand, but I also was continuously interested in the mind. I was a psych major as an undergraduate, and always kind of a spiritual seeker. And by this time, I'd zeroed in. I figured out I was a Buddhist by the time, really, my sophomore year in high school. I started reading some books on Zen, and it was the
Mhm.
first thing I ever read that really made much sense to me. And
Right.
so I kind of knew that, but I hadn't really met a lot of other people. And I was growing up in Missouri; it wasn't exactly a hotbed for that kind of thing. But in my travels, I started to meet more spiritually inclined people. And then
Mhm.
I kind of zeroed in on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and there
Mhm.
weren't very many books published at that time, 4 or 5, mostly the Evans Wentz series, and an
Mhm.
Englishman who did some of the
Yep.
early translations of some of the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, but I was living way up in the mountains of Peru and had those, was trying to study on trying to practice on my own, trying to figure it out on my own. And that's when someone showed up at my house with a copy of Rolling Stone magazine in 1974 with a big feature article about the first sessions, summer sessions at then Naropa Institute, which is now Naropa
Mhm.
University,
Right.
founded by the great Tibetan meditation master Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And when I saw that and saw his name, it just like I just knew I had to go there. It was just there were
Mhm.
even some things I saw in the feature story that things didn't resonate with somebody. It was just him, his name, that and I didn't even know that he was actually of the very lineage I was kind of zeroing in on through my reading.
Mm.
And anyway, so I knew I had to go there, and it took me. Uh, I went up to check it out and came back, and it really took me until I think 1977 to enroll. But I went and got my master's degree there, and it was then a program called Master's Degree in Buddhist and Western Psychology. They now
Mhm.
call it a Master's Degree in Contemplative Psychotherapy. But it
Mhm.
was a very intensive 3-year clinical training program, training us to work with really people experiencing extreme states, schizophrenia, and things like
Mhm.
that. Very, very powerful program, grounded in deep meditation training, which is primarily what I was looking for. I hadn't really decided was going to be a therapist per se, but I wanted that deep meditation training.
Right.
And
Right.
but along the way, I'd gotten caught up living as an expat in South America in small scale drug trafficking, and I financed my way through graduate school with that, and was getting very involved with my teacher in that tradition. But I had this secret life. I'd disappear once or twice a year to South America, do a smuggling run, have enough money to survive, and continue living outside the system. I wasn't trying to get
Oh,
rich. It
wow.
was just a way to live outside the system and keep my problems at bay. My marriage was falling apart, much having to do with my lifestyle. And my wife was from Peru. She never quite assimilated to the U.S. And so I was keeping my problems at bay with money, and I had a lot of cognitive dissonance around being involved in what I was involved in, getting more and more involved in the Buddhist path, and at the
Right.
same time being involved in all this craziness. But I self-medicated around that, to deal with that cognitive dissonance. And I knew it had to end. I was kind of on the way to trying to untangle it, but before I could, I earned my way into uh, a federal drug sentence, and I was
Mhm.
indicted in 1985, and I knew the indictment was coming for about a year, and
Really? How did you guys get I mean, how did you get busted or how did you get rolled up? What's that story? I know it's probably not
yeah,
something you love to talk about, but it's interesting to hear.
uh, so the proverbial last run, right? We decided to, so
Mhm.
we things had kind of fallen apart, and in different ways. So I'm just going to go do one more run, kind of pay off our bills, come out with a little, cash positive, and leave this behind. And of course,
Right.
that's when you get caught. I didn't actually get caught on that run, but an associate of mine did, and I was actually on the island of Curacao on the run for 3 or 4 days, and escaped that island and made my way back to the U.S. and and that associate of mine never did cooperate, but he had somebody with him who did. And then somebody else I've been involved with, ended up getting busted. And then some other people I've been involved with, and various people I've been involved with ended up getting busted and started cooperating and decided to invite me to the party. So,
Uh-huh. Mhm.
so I knew that I was being investigated, and in fact, at one point they seized my home, and
Hmm.
I was trying to make a decision whether to go on the run or stay and face this. And I put that question to my spiritual teacher, and he advised me that I should stay and face it, and that I wouldn't really be able to continue as his student if I was living life on the run. But even if I had
Hmm.
to do serious prison time, I could continue as a practitioner, as his student. And
Hmm.
it was kind of a relief. I mean, I was terrified of going to prison, but also not really thrilled about the idea of being on the run. I actually had very little financial resources at that time, the way things worked out. And in
Hmm.
fact, I was working selling cars for a living to support my family. And so it was kind of a relief, and it was really the first time I ever took anybody's advice. And
Wow.
before that, if you want me to do something, just tell me the opposite. But
Right.
I did take that advice, and I turned myself in, and as tough as that journey was, I've really never regretted it. Um,
Hmm.
and, my time in prison was a bit unique because I went in with a lot of skills already. I mean,
Hmm.
prison for most people is incredibly damaging and debilitating, and people
Hmm.
mostly come out worse than when they went in. But I went in with a lot of skills. I already had a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology. I've been trained as a meditation teacher. And, I had a good, strong context from my early education in my family, despite the shadow issues and the alcoholism. But I had a lot of preparation. So I went in there, and the shock of going to prison really woke me up, obviously, and
Yeah.
and more than anything, it was the fact that my son was 9 years old then, and he was going to grow up without his dad. And I was
Mm.
originally sentenced to 30 years without parole, a 30-year no parole sentence, and I was
Wow.
35 years old. Pretty much thought my life as I'd known it was over with, and that my son was literally I'd have pretty much abandoned him and his mother. His mother and I had been separated for quite a while, but nonetheless now is completely abandoning them financially and so forth. And so I was absolutely devastated, having to face all the selfish decisions I've been
Yeah.
making for so
Yeah.
long, and putting my son's life at risk and his mom at risk, and I just really had to face all that, and I was absolutely devastated. So I became radically dedicated to get all the negativity out of my life and to take
Right.
all the good I've been given and do something with it. I didn't know surety that I would even survive my prison time, but I wanted
Right.
to do something with it if I could that would leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison, or even his dad died in prison.
Right.
So
It's
I
interesting if I could pause you there.
yeah.
I've often, you I don't know if you experienced this, but when in my early days, especially, as a meditation student, and, as I mentioned earlier, I got my start in Zen and read Suzuki's book and was really inspired. This is my 18, 19-year-old. And then I found a martial arts grandmaster named Nakamura, who was a Zen master. And small group of us would take periodic retreats up at the Zen Mountain Monastery
Mhm.
in Woodstock, New York.
Mhm.
And so in those early days, I had fantasies about being, like a yogi monk in a cave. And then I went in the military and became a Navy SEAL, continued my practice. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool because the military vastly simplified things for me. I didn't really have to worry about money anymore. Money just came into my bank account, a lot of it tax free. And I had all this time to train. And I've often fantasized that's more on the negative side. The prison could be the same thing if you were a spiritual seeker. It's like you get your own cave to train in. And if I find myself in prison, I went and donated a few thousand of my books through the prison fellowship. And so I got to visit a Norwalk prison. And it shattered my fantasy. But my fantasy was, man, I get to go and I get fed 3 meals a day and I can just work out and meditate. Probably wasn't like that for you, but
Yeah.
is there any Was there any truth to that? You know, it provided you that protected space to advance your practice,
Yeah, well, people sometimes do try to make that comparison of a prison and a, you know, an ashram or a monastery or something like that.
right?
And there really is very little comparison other than that you get, you know, three hots and a cot, right? And, you
Right.
know, you all wear more or less the same clothes and your life is simplified and, you know, so in that sense it's similar, but ashrams and monasteries are set up for awakening and for mindfulness and being awake
Right.
and leading a disciplined life. And in prison, people are just trying to be mindless, you know, just get through their time and numb out and not experience it. And they're full of chaos and noise and
Right.
anger and violence. I mean, they're really horrific environments. And
Mm.
so, yeah, it's nothing like that. Nonetheless, I was very dedicated, and so
Mhm.
I did live a very monastic life in there, a life, but also a life of service. So I actually took monastic vows while I was in there because I wanted to experiment what would it mean to be a monk in prison.
Mhm.
And it, well, you know, it wasn't just about being celibate, but what to live a really disciplined life in prison. And
Mhm.
I felt if I could figure something out, maybe that's something I could share with other prisoners. So
Mhm.
I ended up taking I took novice monastic vows in the Tibetan tradition that I'd already been part of, um, and and then I actually got the interesting the way I got involved with Zen was, you know, I found even though I'd taken these vows and I was corresponding with Pema Chodron, who was part of my lineage and
Mhm.
has the same
Mhm.
teacher I do, one of the
Yep.
most famous Buddhist teachers in the world today. But
Right.
I was corresponding with Pema as kind of my monastic mentor, and but I still found it very hard, even though I was leading this very disciplined life and practicing a lot to remember the monastic part because I wasn't wearing robes. There was nothing else to remind me of it. And at one point, I had this idea well, because Trungpa Rinpoche was very close to a number of Zen teachers, and he used to wear a raksu over his Western style suit a lot when he taught. Raksu is that
Mhm.
Zen vestment. It's an
Right.
abbreviated vestment. It's a cloth around the neck and a kind of a square vestment here and that's worn by Zen priests and Zen teachers, and so he had two of them, and one of the things I traveled with him a lot. I was one of his close attendants and traveled with him a lot, and I would take care of his robes and almost would put them on him before he would teach, and so I was very familiar with that. I thought, well, maybe I could get a Zen Raksu, and I had already started this organization, Prison Dharma Network, to support other Buddhist prisoners and people, Buddhist volunteers, people interested in bringing Buddhism and Dharma and meditation into the prison system. So
Mhm.
I started that nonprofit, and one of the teachers on our spiritual board of advisors was Daido Lori from Zen, not from Zen, yeah, Zen Mountain Monastery, yeah, from the same place we
Okay.
were going,
Yep.
John Daido Lori Roshi, and
Yeah, he was the teacher, Dido.
yeah,
He was
yeah, Daido,
the former merchant marine with
yeah,
tattoos all over
yeah.
his body. What a neat guy.
So I wrote to
Passed away.
him, and you know, it was a kind response, but he said, you know, well, if you're going to do that, you're really going to have to become my student. You're going to have to do this, and it was about jumping through all these hoops, right? You know, and I understood that, but I already had a full blown tradition. I didn't, you know, I was like, and so, but I realized he was being honoring his own tradition, but there was kind of no acknowledgement of the fact that I'd been a serious practitioner for like 15 years already, um, and I don't fault him for that at all. It just didn't connect. But then later I read about Bernie Glassman, who's his Dharma brother and his
Mhm.
senior, really, because Bernie was the first person made a Roshi by Maizumi Roshi, who was both of their teachers, both of theirs teacher. And uh, when I read about Bernie starting the Zen Peacemaker Order in somewhere in the mid 90s, it just really struck me this idea of being able to fully embrace a monastic path, but your vocation being in the streets, not in a
Mhm.
monastery,
Mhm.
and the integration of social action and Zen and so forth. And that was really just who I was, what I wanted to do. And I wasn't going to give up my own Tibetan tradition, but I thought I could do this as well. And I actually got permission from my teacher in the Tibetan tradition, who was by then Trungpa Rinpoche's son. Trungpa Rinpoche had died, but I got permission, and I wrote to Bernie, and Bernie was just an immediate yes, right? You know, he was just like,
Mhm.
absolutely, you know, you're exactly the kind of person we're looking for. You're already doing it. We can empower you further. And so I started studying with Bernie, and that began my Zen path. And I studied with Bernie uh, probably from 1994 through the rest of my prison time, and I ended
How
up
do you
doing
study
Jukai
with
in
someone
prison with him, and yeah.
Sorry, if you're in prison, how did that work? Like, how did you actually study with him? Was it through phone conversations or
Yeah, correspondence and phone conversations, both with he
Okay,
and his wife then, Jishu Holmes. Um,
okay,
I corresponded with both of them, and they both came to visit me in the prison quite a few times. They're very
really?
generous.
Wow.
And they came in to do the Jukai ceremony for me, which is when you become a lay practitioner with the commitments to the lineage and the Bodhisattva
Mhm,
vow and so forth. And
mhm,
then later I was ordained a novice priest in the Zen Peacemaker order while in prison.
mm,
And and today I'm a Roshi in that tradition. And
mm,
Bernie made me a Roshi about 3 years ago, just a year before he died. And so anyway, I've had these dual paths all along, both the Tibetan tradition and the Zen tradition, and that's still true today. I'm a senior teacher in both, and I would say the Tibetan tradition really my core practice lineage, but I'm also very involved in the Zen peacemaker work, and especially because it's all about integrating Zen with peacemaking and social action and social justice work. But
mm,
during my prison years, what it was like was, um, I this was a maximum security federal prison hospital. There were
right.
1,000 patients, 600 medical, 400 psychiatric, and then about
Wow.
300 general population inmates there to help run the place. I was among that group, and I got a job teaching school because I had a master's degree. So my day job for 14 years was teaching school and helping other inmates learn to read or get their GED or study for college classes. I managed to get a meditation group started in the prison chapel that met twice a week. We started the first hospice. I was there in the height of the AIDS epidemic, so we started the first hospice in a prison anywhere in the world, and
Wow.
that was a big part of my life for 11 years. All my meal breaks and a lot of my free time up in the hospital, caring for men who were dying of AIDS and other illnesses as well. And that gave birth to these two national organizations. I ended up starting Prison Dharma Network to support prisoners interested in Buddhism and meditation, and then National Prison and Hospice Association to get that prison and hospice model out into the world. And today there's probably 75 or 80 prison and hospice programs in the U.S. alone today, and it's really transformed end of life care in prison. So those are a
Mm,
big part of my life while I was there in prison. And
mhm,
I got really disciplined into getting physically fit and working out all the time, very active in the hospice work, very active in 12-step work,
mhm,
just really working on transforming myself, meditated 2 or 3 hours a day, studied 2 or 3 hours a day, just led this very, very disciplined kind of monastic lifestyle, but also engaged, having a job and engaged in service activities. So, um, and I ended up doing 14 years. When I went in, I thought I was going to do 30. The next day in the paper, it said I'd be 65 before I'd have any chance of release. But once I got in, I learned how the good time worked under the old law. I was sentenced before 1987. Everything changed in 1987 but in the federal system. But I was sentenced in 1985. So then you got a lot of good time, especially if you had a sentence 10 years or longer. You got 10 days a month statutory good time, and then 5 days a month, what they call extra good time or work good time or can't good time if you just kept a job and you earned that as you went. So it took me a while to figure all that out, but I eventually realized that if I stayed out of trouble, I'd serve 18 and a half, and that still felt like forever. And
right.
then it took my appeal about 3 years to go through the courts, or 2.5, 3 years, and they knocked off one of the five counts I'd been convicted of, and that reduced my sentence from 30 down to 25. So then at that point, I knew I would serve 14 and a half on on my sentence, and that's what I ended up serving,
Mm,
14 inside and then 6 months in a halfway house and on um, uh, house arrest when I got out.
mhm.
But,
Oh,
that was my lifestyle in there. It was just totally focused on training myself and on discipline, but doing it in an environment that I really had to completely create that for myself. There was nothing in the
right,
environment that supported it.
right. That's interesting. Fascinating stories. You brought up a ton of questions, of course. And I want to let me just back into it because you just made a comment that I think is really important. I mean, it's one of the reasons that Dharma societies exist and ashrams is that environmental and also social support for a practice. And I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of people who get into mindfulness today, they fall off the course. It's difficult for them if they don't have an environment as well as the Dharma group, the social support. And is there any advice you have for people to like stay the course if they don't have that, or where they can find those two things that are missing?
Well, there's so much available today, and there's so much available online. Now, unfortunately, we're missing the in-person
Right,
quality of being involved in Dharma groups and sanghas and communities. It's very
right,
important. But at
right,
the same time, there's so much available online. In fact, many students are having so much more contact with their teachers than they ever had before because, especially
right.
well-known teachers, you might go to a retreat with them once or twice a year, and then you go back home and you have your practice. Maybe you have your local group that you sit with or something. But, now so many, major Dharma teachers they're teaching on a regular basis over Zoom, and their students are, having a lot more contact with them. So that's quite interesting. But, I think you need for me, uh, I mean, having that social support and being part of a community, I think is really important, not only in terms of supporting our practice, but it's very much part of the practice. I mean, certainly in the
Right,
Zen tradition and Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which are both part of Mahayana Buddhism,
right.
uh, you know, any notion of realization really shows up in the relational field. That's where you actually see if people are actually becoming more awake and more realized and more compassionate and kinder, and
Mhm,
that
mhm.
shows up in the relational field. And so, our practice, there is the solitary part of our practice, which is incredibly important. But then there's the communal aspect of it, and they're both important. I also think it's important to get really good instruction. Now, I've been a
Yeah.
student of the art of meditation for more than 50 years now, and I've studied meditation from all different traditions, all the different Buddhist traditions, and even from Hindu traditions and Taoist traditions. I really consider myself, a student of the art of it as well as the science of it, with
Mhm,
what's emerged in a neuroscientific study of mindfulness and meditation over the last 10 to 20 years. And so,
mhm.
um, I think I think a lot of people get insufficient instruction,
Yes.
and therefore they really struggle with the practice, and they struggle with working with their mind, and they find it hard, and they find it boring, and it's hit or miss, and it doesn't have to be that way. I've
Mhm,
developed a model called neurosomatic mindfulness, which is a
mhm,
deeply embodied approach, neuroscientifically informed, deeply embodied approach to the practice that can help people stabilize their mind much more quickly and start experiencing, the profound states of awareness that you read about in the books much more quickly.
mhm.
And when you start experiencing that, you're much more likely to continue because you go, "Wow, this
Right.
this is actually doing something. This works. This is amazing," right? And so you're
Mhm,
much more likely to continue, right? So I think it's really important to get really good instruction and to have
mhm.
an ongoing relationship with some kind of teacher or mentor. And then as we've been discussing, I think the community aspect is very important.
So that brings it, and this is actually personal to me because, similar to you, but I came through the martial arts tradition, and
Mhm,
I've done a number of martial arts. I have 3 different black belts, and I now pursue aikido. So I have some instruction there, but, they're not meditation teachers, right?
mhm.
And then through yoga, I found some great instruction there, but still, it wasn't, the yoga the way it's transmitted to the West didn't have the meditative practices really come with it. And so I've done this kind of like smorgasbord, and
Mhm.
then here I am at my age with meditating since I was 21, finding I'm kind of doing it on my own. And so a lot of people. This relates to what you're just talking about. How do you find a teacher and a lineage that you just know is right for you? Right, because
Yeah.
there's no one right way for, and I've tried a number of things. I said, "Oh, interesting, but that's not right for me." I thought Zen was right for me, and it could still be, but I found a difficulty finding a teacher here in San
Mhm.
Diego. But now I'm thinking, well, that's because I was thinking I had to do it in person. So to answer the broader questions, how does one find a lineage or a teacher that they think is right for them? Do you just keep trying things out, or use your intuition?
Yeah, I
What's
actually
the
had a close friend who's a wonderful Zen teacher in San Diego, but she's retired now and actually living down in, the Baja, I think. Seizan, who was
okay,
part of my same lineage, my Zumi lineage,
right,
in Soto Zen. And, but, that's a perennial question. How do you
right,
find that teacher, that lineage that really is the right home for you? Uh, you know, I had bounced around quite a bit as I was interested in this. I got involved in Gurdjieff work a little bit. I read all the books. I was very interested, but I got around a couple of groups. I didn't resonate so much. I'd had contact with this and that around, and could have easily gotten involved in a few things, but it just wasn't, the clarity wasn't there. As I
Mhm.
said, when I first saw Trungpa Rinpoche's name, even in that article in Rolling Stone magazine, something, just gravitational pull just practically grabbed me by the throat. And then when I got up there to check out Naropa, it still, everything kind of felt very clear.
Mhm.
It took me a while because in the meantime, my son was born, and he originally had some heart issues, which fortunately resolved themselves. And so it wasn't until 1977 that I was able to enroll. But when I first got on in Boulder, Colorado, and started going to classes and just being around some of the teachers, most of whom were students of Trungpa Rinpoche, not all, but especially in the Buddhist classes they were. And I just got around that world, and it was just that the square peg had found the square hole. It was just
Mhm.
like thunk. I just knew I was home, and I've been very grateful for that clarity that has never departed from me. And
Mhm.
so I don't know whether that, who knows whether that has to do with past lifetimes and connections and karmic
Mhm.
connections. I don't know. People may or may not even consider the possibility of multiple lifetimes, but it's hard to say. But I think generally we will know when we found that tradition that's right for us. But I think we need to go in really clear-eyed.
Mhm.
And one we've often had, if you want to know about a teacher and their teaching, look at the students. What do you see in the students? Now you can't expect the students to be perfect in any way, shape, or form, because we're all at feet of clay. We're all human beings. We're all struggling. We're doing our best, and until somebody attains complete realization, up to the very moment of that kind of realization, they're still subject to all kinds of problems and obstacles and neurosis and so forth. And even people can have, I think, profound levels of realization, and it still may not be complete. There still can be kind of
Right.
shadow stuff going on, which is why some teachers, have gotten in trouble with various scandals
Mhm.
around money and sex and different things and power. And
Right.
it doesn't mean they didn't have any realization. It just that means it wasn't, complete. There was
Wasn't
still
complete.
shallow things they hadn't dealt with. And so it's complex, right? So I don't think we should expect perfection from our teachers or from their students, but you need to see that there's something genuine going on, that there's some real,
Mhm.
that people are being processed, and there's some kind of a willingness to really commit to practice and commit to a path. Today I think I don't want to get off on this theme too much, but there's a certain kind of strain of I've been an activist and been involved in social justice work at least since I went to prison. So for a
Mhm.
long time now, and I'm still very involved in trying to transform our criminal justice system by bringing mindfulness-based intervention not only to the incarcerated, but also to everybody that works in the system, the correctional officers,
Mhm.
the probation and parole officers, the judges, prosecutors, the police, and so forth. That's a very big part of my life today. And I've been involved in all kinds of peace work and social change work. But nonetheless, there is a kind of social justice movement milieu today
Mhm.
that I personally feel is kind of a wrong path, and
I
very
agree.
blame and shame focused. And it is really just come in and taken over our society. And
Right.
it's really influencing all the Dharma traditions as well. And I think there's a
Interesting.
lot of people today involved in various meditation centers that they think that ideology and the Dharma are the same thing, and they're not at all. You know,
They're not. Yeah,
they're
I
not at
agree with
all.
that.
And I'm
They're
not
not
saying
coming from love. It's gotta come, any kind of justice has to come from love.
absolutely has to come from love. I just interviewed for one of our summits an amazing woman who lives in the state of Acre in Brazil, very remote part of the Amazon rainforest, and she and her husband is chief of the Yawanawa people, and she's
Mm.
originally a native person from she's Zapotec from Mexico, from Oaxaca, but they met, and she'd been an activist for indigenous rights and climate emergency all over the Americas for a long time, and now she and her husband lead the Yawanawa people in this very challenged part of the Amazon rainforest. And she could have been talking all about the injustices and how modern people are destroying the world. She could have gone. That wasn't her message at all. She was very clear
Mhm.
about what we need to do, but it was a message of love and inclusivity and working together.
Mhm.
There was just
Mhm.
none of that blame and shame approach to activism.
Mhm.
And yet she's
Mhm.
fierce. She's fierce for protecting the rainforest and protecting the rights of indigenous people. But she
Mhm.
totally comes from that Gandhian, Kingian tradition of love.
Mhm.
And
Beautiful,
so
yeah.
anyway, that's not what's current today, and it's really affecting a lot of Dharma communities. And many of which I think are tend to be more focused on political correctness than they are on actual dharma these days. So I think
That's
it can, and I think it's trouble for the teachers too, because I think a lot of teachers are hesitant around their students anymore to really teach,
they
and
don't want to get canceled.
they don't want to get canceled, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so
Oh my
you're
God.
going to make keep because you tickle somebody's ego a little bit, and suddenly they're after you, you know. So
Right.
I think it's tougher than ever to find, but they're there. That they are
They're
there.
there.
The genuine thing is still there. It can be found.
Yeah, and I think a key point is that they're not going to find you. You have to
Yeah,
be seeking,
exactly.
right? You got to be on the
I
path, and
think
when you're
so. In
ready to
fact,
teach
there
them.
is a period in our life when we think, "Well, man, my teacher's gonna find me," you know?
Just going to magically appear,
It
right?
doesn't
No,
really
no,
work that way.
no. I agree. You mentioned there's a couple things that interesting to me. I also grew up with an alcoholic family, many generations, both sides. And so I had, when you were talking about your childhood, it was really reminding me of mine. And this growing up in a village of 375 in upstate New York, dairy country, and all the chaos of the house and whatnot. And for me, I found solace in nature because I got outside a lot, and maybe you did too. But in the last, few years, I found a lot of benefit, and I know a lot of people found benefit in the 12-step traditions, Al-Anon for me particularly, right?
Mhm,
And I'm not an active participant, but I know I occasionally attend a class with my wife, and I know people who use that as a complete spiritual practice. Do you think
absolutely.
the 12-step programs can be like a dharma practice in and of
Mhm.
itself like that?
Very much so,
Yeah.
yeah. It was a big part of my path while I was in prison. I was very active in the 12-step groups there. We had both Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, kind of a joint group. I had
Mhm.
amazing sponsors that came in from the outside. And, that was one place in prison. You at least once a week we're up in a space where you're with fellow human beings that just treated you like ordinary fellow human beings. And there was no,
Right.
because otherwise in prison generally you're regarded as less than human. And there's a real edge around how you're treated. And even some of the volunteers that come in from the outside and some religious groups, it's a little bit of this patronizing thing. But these were just fellow drunks and addicts, and they just come in. So it was like at least once a week you were kind of out of prison and in the human realm, at least up in that room for an hour and a half. And so it was a
Mhm.
real blessing. And we had great sponsors. One of them remained my close friend until his death just a couple of years ago. And, that was a big part of my path of transformation. When I got out, I was going to meetings for a little bit. I didn't quite find a meeting. I released to Boulder, Colorado. I didn't quite find the meeting that I really connected with, but part of it was I was really busy with my own life and my own spiritual path, and I wasn't going to be able to make that my primary path or become a person resourcing it like I was in prison. Like in prison, I was like the backstop resourcing that program for 14 years because people
Mhm.
came and went, and I kept training people into all the positions, but I was always in the background keeping it going. And one of my early sponsors said, if you want this program to really work for you, become somebody that's making it work for others, that's getting it off in, the
Mhm.
basic 12 step. And so I really believed in that. And so just being kind of a consumer of the meetings was a little difficult, bit of an adjustment. And at some point, I realized that alcohol really wasn't an issue for me anymore, nor were drugs. And my own Tibetan Buddhist path is so demands so much time and so much commitment that it just didn't make sense to continue both. So I didn't. But I love the path. I have a very close friend that I do a lot of work in the criminal justice world with, and I would say that he's also a meditator. But in many
Mhm.
ways, I would say the 12-step work is his core community and his core path, right? So
Yeah,
it's a beautiful program, and it's saved countless lives. So I'm a big believer in it.
and that's fascinating. I agree with that. Um, could you describe this is again something that's really interesting to me because I've studied Zen in my early years and then Zazen, Tibetan Buddhism, more recently. What do you see as the primary differences between the two paths?
Well, in terms of Tibetan Buddhism, it depends on who the teacher is. My teacher, Trungpa
Okay.
Rinpoche, who died in 1987, really emphasized basic meditation practice. And he
Mhm.
actually incorporated some of the Zen forms. And, we
Mhm.
had these month-long sittings called datans, which was similar to a Zen sesshin, except
Mhm.
longer.
Mhm.
Or some people would go that. We also had what we call weekthans, which is basically a 7-day intensive, very similar
Mhm.
to the form of the sesshin. And the basic
Mhm.
shamatha vipassana meditation practice in the Tibetan tradition is very similar to Zazen. They're both
Mhm.
They're very similar. Of course, there are different approaches to Zazen, and
Mhm.
some people are doing breath counting and different
Mhm.
things, and then there's shikantaza, just sitting. And in
Mhm.
general, in Zen, there's maybe less. My experience is teachers give less precise instruction. It's you just kind
Mhm.
of go sit on your cushion and figure it out. I don't
Right.
particularly think that. I mean, you'll get there eventually as long as you stay on your cushion. But I don't think. I think I personally believe in giving people much more helpful instruction, and I
Yeah.
think the Tibetan tradition has a lot. I mean, it's the Tibetan culture. They embraced Buddhism back in the 8th or ninth century and
Mhm.
brought it from northern India and some influence from China into that remote Himalayan region and worked on it for 1500 years without much interference. And
Mhm. Right.
either it became like the Harvard, Stanford, of
Mhm.
uh, Oxford University of Buddhism, right? I mean,
Right.
tremendous depth. And so, but the basic practice is very similar. But then in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you have all these various Dita yoga practices, visualization, and mantra. You have the deep inner yoga practices. So you have all this advanced tantric vajrayana kind of practice, which is
Right.
really high tech spirituality, is basically what
Right.
it is, which you don't have in Zen. In terms of the view, though, in terms of the kind of understanding of the nature of mind, there is a lot of similarity.
Right.
The ultimate view, as understood in both the Tibetan and then there are a lot. In fact, people have written books. Sometimes the highest view in Tibetan Buddhism and the highest, more formless practices are what are called Dzogchen or
Right.
Mahamudra. And
Mhm.
people have written books about the similarity between shikantaza, or just sitting in the Zen tradition, and Mahamudra and Dzogchen in the Tibetan tradition. So,
Right.
there are a lot of parallels. And my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, my first teacher, he wrote a fabulous book called uh, the skull cup and the teacup, or the teacup and the
Mhm.
skull cup. I can't remember. The teacup
Mhm.
representing Zen, and the skull cup representing Tibetan Buddhism, because it's used ritually, right? And
Mhm.
but anyway, it was the book is based on a set of seminars he gave, and those were transcribed and edited into a book. But it was all about Zen and Vajrayana Buddhism, and it's a fascinating book. Highly recommend
Mhm.
it. Um, but at any rate, there's a lot of they very much sync up. There's certainly no conflict in my life, being
Right.
deeply
Mhm.
involved in both. There's no place where they conflict.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Interesting. And I'm very influenced by the yogic tradition and understand Tantra path, and so it's interesting to see the effect of yoga and the Indian tradition on the Tibetan Buddhism. I think there's a lot of overlap and
Hmm.
and uh, and then some dissimilar things.
Yeah,
So,
while I was in prison, interestingly, for some reason, I guess I was reaching out, and then people were finding me. But I became really connected. I was distant from any centers of my own community, the then Bajadatu, now the International Shambhala community. And there wasn't much going on, and this prison was in Springfield, Southwest Missouri, so there wasn't much going on there. Although there were a couple of local practitioners that did come in and sit with us, with
mhm,
our group. But uh, at any rate, I ended up getting connected with people in all kinds of different Western Buddhist traditions and
mhm,
also other traditions, more Hindu yogic
mhm,
traditions and so forth. And many close relationship I have today. So unlike a lot of practitioners who mostly know about their tradition, their community, their tradition, I'm really broadly connected. And then, of course,
mhm,
because of the prison work and then other things, I became very immersed in the secular mindfulness world. So I'm very broadly connected there as well. And
mhm,
I know most of the major teachers in the Western Dharma traditions and secular mindfulness traditions as friends and colleagues, and so I've just gotten connected in that way. But I also have some very close connections in other traditions. One of my closest spiritual brothers is a teacher in a tradition that uh, is kind of a mixture of the impersonalist Advaita school
mhm,
and the influence of Ramana Maharshi
mhm,
in Indian spiritual
mhm,
culture, and then more the Divine Mother Bhakti Yoga, like Papa Ramdas. And his
mhm.
particular teacher was influenced by both of those, was Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar from
Right.
Tirumnambala, India. And then he's this community is also very connected with the Bowls of Bengal, which is a tantric sect originally mostly located in Bengal, India, who are they're kind of like gypsies, and they're musicians and dancers, and they've been persecuted a lot, but they attribute their origins to both Hindu and Buddhist tantra. And so
Interesting.
anyway,
Yeah.
my friend who has an ashram up in Montana, He's really one of my closest spiritual brothers, and I go up and visit his ashram a lot. And his teacher had an ashram in Arizona. His teacher passed about 10 years ago, but I used to go down and teach at that ashram as well. So I've been very connected across these traditions, and there is a lot of intersection. When
Right.
you get into deep inner yogic work, I mean, it's all related. There's different systems and different approaches, but things are mixing. I mean, we have access to all of it in the West today in ways that just mind-boggling. It's all in
Right.
Wikipedia, right? And
That's
everything's
right.
been published, and there's all this interchange. But this isn't the first time that happened. There were times in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, when when there were mystics and yogis running around in that interchange, and who were Christian
Hmm.
Nestorians, who were Hindu yogis, who were Buddhist yogis, or Sufis, and that interchange has happened before.
Right.
And so, when you get into deeply working with our mind and being, there's a universality to it. We're all the same. We all have the same basic mind, consciousness, and being. So these
Right.
different traditions all have a way in, and I really, really appreciate all of it.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. One of the things that is challenging for a lot of people, and you kind of alluded to it, you had been a practitioner for many, many years, but and maybe was chipping away at your emotional and moral well-being, but it wasn't transformative, right? And I think, was it John Kabat-Zinn who wrote After Enlightenment, Take Out the Trash? And
Mhm.
my one of my yoga instructors said, if you're an asshole and you meditate for 20 years, you might be just a more focused asshole.
Right. Well,
So how do we get the moral and emotional
yeah.
development built
Well,
into a practice?
you know, the fact that I was, really a serious practitioner before I went to prison really begs the question, how the heck did that happen, right? Well, suffice it to say, I was really compartmentalizing my life, right? And
Right.
I was choosing to ignore a lot of what my teacher was saying, and I was focusing on what I was interested in, which was basically the mind and awareness and meditation training. And I was completely ignoring the ethical foundations of the Dharma, and
Right.
and also he really emphasized, you know, not compartmentalizing your life. If you show up
Hmm.
and you look really good in a meditation hall, but you go home and you got a sink full of dirty dishes, there's something fishy about that, right? So he
Right.
was all about not compartmentalizing, completely
Hmm.
integrating into your life. But I wasn't doing that. I was ignoring that.
Hmm.
Even though I was completely committed to that lineage and that teaching, I just was still caught up in my own conditioning and
Hmm.
compartmentalization, and also my addictions and all the rest of it. So when I got locked up, that cleaved all that craziness away, and I was really able to focus. But also, I realized what was really missing in my life, what had been missing, was a focus on the ethical foundations. So I
Right.
decided to completely build my life in prison based on, to begin with, the lay precepts of the Buddhist tradition, which are
Hmm.
classic, religious precepts of
Right.
refraining from killing, refraining from lying,
Hmm.
refraining from
Hmm.
stealing, refraining from sexual misconduct, refraining from misuse of intoxicants. And then I
Right.
went on to take the novice monastic vows, which adds some more, right? But I was really serious about grounding every aspect of my life in those precepts. I knew that had to be the foundation from which I built a new life. And so I was really, really serious about that. And I also got really clear about the nature of cause and effect and karma. Like if I came up to the vending machine and there was a quarter in it, I'm leaving it there. It's like, because I don't want the
Right.
karma of that, right?
Right.
I'm here experiencing all this karma. Now I'm in prison for all the. I don't want any more, right? I'm just going to live cleanly as I can, and so that was a big part of it, but also really understanding not morality had been introduced to me in my Roman Catholic education as more of a should, right?
Hmm.
And then with a kind of a big punishment reward context to it,
Hmm.
right? And in Buddhism, you begin to understand when you dive deeply. I mean, there are other precepts and there's guidelines to help beginning to lead an awake life and a compassionate life and an ethical life and a moral life. But ultimately, if you dive deep into these teachings, it's really understanding that this is how life actually works. That if you really
Hmm.
understand cause and effect and you really understand how life works, you're naturally going to be motivated to live an ethical, moral life because you realize this is actually what works, right? And
Right.
wisdom and wisdom is inherent in the nature of reality, and wisdom is inherent in the nature of our being. And when we go deep enough, we begin to get that clarity. So then you don't
Hmm.
really so much need the external reinforcements because it's really you're beginning to allow to bring forth what we really are, the depth of our being, which is naturally ethical, moral, compassionate, awake, and so forth, right? But
Right.
initially, it is helpful to take vows and have precepts. I've taken so many vows in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and the Zen tradition. I've taken so many vows that if I err, I'm headed for lifetimes of problems, right? Because I've made so many commitments, and I that is good for me. That's good. I know,
Mhm.
that I have some pretty clear boundary markers out there, right? If I'm starting to get out of my lane, I'm going to feel it pretty quickly, right? So it is helpful for any of us to have those things, but it's helpful if we can, unlike in some religious traditions where ethical codes and morality is presented as shoulds, and if you veer, you're going to be punished, and it's about good and bad and good and evil and so forth. In the Buddhist tradition, it's really just practice, and
Mhm.
and in some ways, even with precept practice, even if you make lifelong commitment, it's always a 24-hour practice, and
Mhm.
you renew your commitments in the morning. And you do your best during the day to live ethically and live according to your principles, your commitments. And at the end of the day, you see how you did. And if you see places where you're veered off or dropped the ball or really screwed up, you acknowledge that to yourself. And if you're in a community, you might acknowledge it to a teacher or to your fellow practitioners, but you at least acknowledge it to yourself. And you purify, let go, and then the next day you start with a fresh start. You always start with
That's
a fresh start. So it's precepts are there to clarify our habitual patterns and let us actually see all the confusion of our life and our conditioning and the legacy the fear and survival based legacy we all inherit, and to really see that with clarity so we can begin untangling it and naturally begin to lead an ethical life. But it's not about shoulds, and it's not about good and bad and punishment. It's really about it's just practice, and it's just clarification, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Practicing as a daily, just a daily initiative. My teacher Nakamura used the expression "one day, one lifetime,"
Mhm.
and this is what he was talking about. You wake up and then you begin your practice, and then at the end of the day, you look back and you learn from what went well and what didn't go well,
Mhm.
and then tomorrow, hopefully we get another chance. That's beautiful. Simple.
Mhm.
You wrote a book, Radical Responsibility: How to Move Beyond Blame, Fearlessly Live Our Higher Purpose, and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good in the World. Uh, the message is pretty clear from that, but what's the key point that you'd love listeners to know and inspire
Mhm.
them to go out and get this book and get on the path?
Yeah. Well, I that book came out 2 or 3 years ago, and, but
Mhm.
I've been leading radical responsibility seminars and workshops, all over North America and Europe, even Latin America for about 18 years. And,
Mhm.
I finally got the book out. But where that philosophy and model kind of emerged for me was really in prison. Like, when I got
Mhm.
locked up, it became really clear to me the world I was in was full of negativity and bitterness and
Mhm.
anger and violence, and everybody had a big victim story going on. In fact, generally,
Mhm.
when you met a fellow prisoner, the ritual was you might go out and walk the track, on a meal break or something, and they share their victim story, you share your victim story, right? And after I went through
Mhm.
that a few times, I didn't want to hear my story. And, like your lawyer screwed you over and your fall partners, all the whole victim story. And I didn't want to hear mine anymore. And I didn't really want to hear theirs, which wasn't very compassionate, but that's just not where I wanted to be. And I
Mhm.
realized that if I didn't proactively do something else, I could easily come out of prison angry and bitter and get caught up even while I was living. I didn't want to live that way while I was there. And it's natural that prisoners go there because when you get arrested, the whole process of being arrested and going through the justice system and being incarcerated, you're just being demonized and buried under a mountain of guilt and shame. Now, maybe you have caused
Mhm.
harm, but nonetheless, the process is just like almost annihilating you under this mountain of shame and blame and guilt and
Mhm.
demonization. So naturally,
Mhm.
people just kind of armor up just to survive psychically,
Mhm.
and mentally
Mhm.
and emotionally. And generally, they armor up with bitterness and anger and with their own victim story. And
Mm.
that's really sad because for me, the real process of transformation begins when you can actually really see the impact your behaviors have had on others, the harmful impact, and develop a not feeling bad about yourself, not guilt and shame, but genuine remorse and regret, where you really say, wow, wow, I
Yeah.
see. Yeah, I really created harm for others, and if there's any way I could undo that or repair that, or if I could wind the clock back, right, that genuine, because that's about others. And it's very
Mhm.
hard for most prisoners to contact that because they're protecting themselves from this, attack on their being, really. So, but anyway, I didn't want that's not where I wanted to go. And I realized, if I was gonna had any chance of getting out of prison and having any kind of a life when I got out, uh, I needed to embrace 200% ownership for having got myself in there and for what I was going to do with myself while I was there. All the choices that just became crystal clear to me. And so that's what I did. And through doing that, I was able to spend 14 years in a deep path of transformation. But I was also able to create, national movements and national programs, things you're not supposed to be able to do from inside prison. And if I'd ever asked permission, they would have said, no, you're crazy. You can't do that. Um, so that's where it was born, and of course, there were a lot of influences. One influence was I connected with that man who I mentioned before is in that kind of Baul Advaita Bhakti Yoga
Mhm.
tradition, who had a secular training called the Event, and he ran into some of my, I was publishing in various journals while I was in prison. He ran into some of my writings. He wanted to use it in his curriculum. So we got in touch, and we quickly connected, and he came to the prison, and we connected even more in person. And I started reading all this stuff. I wanted to get this training into the prison, and I managed to do it. Got a couple of psychologists to go out and try it, and we got it in. And during the last 3 years I was there, we did the event 4 times. Very
Hmm.
intense 3 day group process that takes you deep in very quickly and very deeply into your family of origin conditioning and traumas and all the rest of it. It helps you shift your relationship to it. And it was
Mhm.
really powerful in prison because once you got, 30 prisoners in the room, you see that 90% of them suffered profound abuse as children,
Yes.
sexual, emotional, physical abuse, just
Mhm.
heartbreaking stuff. And most of them have never shared it with anyone. So,
Mhm.
that some of the context of radical responsibility came from that program, but a lot of different influence, as well as it's grounded in mindfulness, it's grounded in the
Mhm.
context of basic goodness, which is the fundamental teaching of my Tibetan teacher, that we all have innate, unconditional, primordial, basic goodness. That's the
Mhm.
ground of our being. Uh,
Mhm.
Developing a reflective mindfulness awareness practice of some kind, doing emotional intelligence work, and then really learning the science of change, understanding the brain, understanding the mind, understanding how to deconstruct habits that are no longer serving us, how to form new habits. Uh, you know, I use the context a lot of Cartman's drama triangle, understanding the triangulation that creates endless drama throughout the world of the victim, persecutor, rescuer, which just fuels. I mean, it's the basis of all our great novels and plays and so forth, but it
Mhm.
also fuels world conflict and destroys families and
Right.
organizations and kids and families and endless war. It's this basic drama triangle, and people find it incredibly liberating once they see it and can make boundaries with it and learn to get unhooked from it. So, Radical Responsibility is a book. It's really a manual on how to begin to really take ownership for our own life, to understand enough about our own physiology and psychology to really step into an ownership or a self leadership position using
Mhm.
mindfulness techniques, using self regulation techniques. So we're not just being driven by the world around us mechanically, unconsciously. We're actually owning our own life and owning our own circumstances. And, I often describe radical responsibility as voluntarily embracing 100% ownership or responsibility for each and every circumstance we face in life, each and every
Yeah.
circumstance, including those we can see we had something to do with, but also including the ones that we can't see we had anything to do with. They just seem like they fell out of the sky and landed on our heads. But the important thing about this model is the distinction between ownership and blame. Radical responsibility has nothing to do with blame. It's clearly not about blaming others, but it's not one iota about blaming ourselves, and it has nothing to do with blaming victims. It's
Mhm.
about ownership because that's the only place we have any real personal power. I mean, it's
Mhm.
natural. We're all gonna, kvetch and blame, and but how long do we want to indulge that? We want to focus on what can I do? What can I do to move my own life forward, right?
Right.
Because that's the only place I have any power. And so all this is done in a context of tremendous self-compassion, but at the same time, just beginning to see that blaming and complaining and all the rest of it is just a really inefficient use of our time and energy and doesn't take
Right.
us anywhere. In fact, it'll take us backwards. So that's the model. But it's, other people like, oh, your fellow Navy SEAL, what's his name? Extreme ownership.
Jocko, I was just
Yeah,
thinking
Jocko
Jocko
Willing.
Willink,
So extreme
extreme ownership.
ownership is a similar context. And there
Mhm.
are other writers who've written about that kind of mental toughness,
Mhm.
but they don't get so much into the deep how do you do it. They tell you this
Right.
is what you got to do, right? But
Yeah.
how do you do that? How do you understand enough about your own mind and psychology and emotions, and how you develop a reflective awareness practice to actually give yourself the ability to really get in the driver's seat of your own mind? Now, of course,
Mhm.
I'm sure Jocko Willink actually, through his Navy SEAL training, embraced a lot of awareness training that even if it wasn't
Yeah,
called that, right?
that's
So,
right.
but nonetheless, this similar context to books like that, but I would say it's a little more spiritually grounded and goes deeper into the how.
I love that. Yeah, I was going to mention Jocko's book, Extreme
I
Ownership,
love
and
his
this.
book, and I've used it in my consulting work. I have one of my
Yeah,
business clients. I've had all the managers read the book, and we use it a
that's
lot as
great.
a reference point.
Yeah, it's great. Again, it's great for the secular minded and those who just need a little bit of a club over their head to say, go yeah, do this, and here's why it's gonna
Yeah,
why it's important. But I think you're right. The work of self awareness is a little bit more subtle and requires it requires introspection, not
mhm,
doing.
mhm,
And so this is part of the challenge of our society where we got such a massive bias toward action
right.
and tax that we don't take the time to do the
Yeah, doing
introspection.
versus being. Yeah, we don't
That's right.
honor the being quality of life.
Right. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really, really appreciate your time and the work that you're doing. Um, how do people connect with you? And I'm curious about the neurosomatic mindfulness program and the
Mhm.
work that you're doing. How do people find you and where should they kind of start
Yeah,
depending
well,
on
if
their
people are
interest?
interested in my book, Radical Responsibility, they can go to radicalresponsibilitybook.com, and you
Okay.
can read all about the book there. You can get a free chapter download, and you can read all
Hmm.
the accolades from other best-selling authors like Daniel Goleman and Tara Brach and
Hmm.
John Kabat-Zinn and Rick Hansen and
Nice.
many others. And then you can order the book right from there. I mean, you can choose Indie Books or Amazon or Barnes& and Noble, whatever, however you want to order the book. In terms of my courses and the summits that I put on, it's Heart Mind Institute. So you
Hmm.
can go to heartmind.co,
Yeah.
not com, but just co,
Right.
heartmind.co. Um, my basic website is fleetmall.com. You can always start there and find most of what I do from fleetmall.com. And if people are interested in the whole prison work side of what I do, Prison Mindfulness Institute is prisonmindfulness.org. That's the work we do with at-risk, incarcerated, and returning youth and adults. Then we
Hmm.
have the Engage Mindfulness Institute, which is engagemindfulness.org, where we train mindfulness teachers in trauma-informed approaches to bringing mindfulness to underserved populations and people who've been placed at risk. And then we have the Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, which is all about bringing mindfulness based wellness and resiliency to first responders. And
Mm.
so
Awesome.
that's mindfulpublicsafety.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to tracking your work, and I'm looking forward to reading your book, actually. So, um, yeah, enough said. Happy New Year, and may 2022 be a blessed year for you.
Yeah, thank you. Same to you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you
We
very much. I
enjoyed our
appreciate it.
conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. All right, Jeff.